Welcome back to my YouTube channel. And as it's the international break, we have another special guest with us here on the channel. We have Craig Johns, Middlesbrough writer from Teesside Live and all-round good guy. How are you doing, Craig? You all right?
I'm very well, thanks, Phil. How are you?
Yes, not too bad, thank you. All the better for a decent run of results going into the international break.
Yeah, nice win against Leicester, that isn't it? Obviously, the league leaders, and you're looking and you think, you just don't want to go into the international break on the back of a defeat, do you? I know it would have been Leicester, and you could have contextualised that because of how good Leicester are, but getting a win yesterday it just makes that international break feel so much better, doesn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. So what we're going to do with this chat is we've got Craig for a little while, so we're going to speak to him in two parts here. So we're going to speak to him first about his job covering Middlesbrough, which is the dream job for many Middlesbrough fans out there. So just to kind of get his take on what that's like doing that, and then in the second part of this video, we'll be talking a little bit more about Middlesbrough in terms of the team, how Middlesbrough are getting on at the moment, and a little bit of inside information from Craig with regards to the positive feeling at the club at the moment. So, Craig, if we go back to the very start for you, I guess, obviously we're all football fans. We've all got to this point by growing up enjoying football, having our own football heroes, and I guess ultimately that's how you got into journalism. But just talk us through your introduction to football. How did you get involved in the sport first of all?
So I guess it would have just been like most people through family, really. I kind of strange family dynamic in terms of my mum and dad are actually from East Cleveland, Cleveland area. My mum born in Saltburn, my dad Boosbeck, and before I was born, they moved to Sunderland. It's obviously no secret I'm born and bred from Sunderland. They moved to Sunderland because my mum got a job training in the NHS as a nurse, and they kind of just set up home in Sunderland in the end. And that's when obviously me and my sister were then born there. Our wider family, they're all still there. Redcar, Cleveland, Redcar, Boosbeck, Skelton, Gisborough, all still scattered around there. There's only actually me, my mum, my dad, and my sister who live in Sunderland. And yeah, it was a strange dynamic in terms of football because I think one of the misconceptions that many Boro fans still have of me is that I'm a Sunderland fan, and I've never been a Sunderland fan, to be honest, because my dad at that time wasn't. He is now. He's a season ticket holder for his sins. But he never was when I was growing up. He was actually strange. Again, there was him and three brothers, and when they were kids, he tells us that around that area, everyone was Middlesbrough or Man United. And him and his three brothers just decided we're not going to do that. Like, we don't want to fit that mold. So they all decided to pick alternative teams, and my dad ended up with Aston Villa for some strange reason. So yeah, as a kid, I can't really remember him being a Sunderland fan and having that influence on us. Instead, it was one of my uncles. It was me mum's brother, my uncle Bob. He was a massive Man United fan. Um, it's one of them where you look up to someone, you idolize someone. I always have done with my uncle Bob, and I remember Sundays would go, and Man United, since the introduction of Sky, would quite often play on Sundays, and any Sunday they did play that afternoon, I'd get to go up to my uncle Bob's and watch the Man United games, and my love of football kind of stemmed from that, and spending time with my uncle Bob and things like that, and watching Man United, which is kind of where that kind of childhood glory supporting, if you like, came from, or early memories of watching the likes of Eric Cantona, and then a bit later down the line, David Beckham was kind of my first footballing hero. I remember shaved the Mohican into my head when I was in primary school, and luckily wasn't expelled from primary school for that one. But yeah, they were kind of me early football memories, if you like.
Yeah, I think if you've got the choice between Man United and Sunderland, it's a bit of an easy one, isn't it? Especially back in Man United's heyday as well. But so in terms of your introduction into sports journalism, speaking personally, I loved football growing up, loved playing it. Absolutely awful at it. It was never an option for me to pursue it in terms of being a professional or even getting involved in a coaching capacity because I had no wisdom to pass on, basically. So, from your point of view, how did you get into sports journalism? How did you make that decision to make that, I guess, your career of choice?
Yeah, so similar with me, to be honest. I was always the fat kid that got put in goal. I had a skinhead when I was at school, so I used to get called Paddy Kenny. It was my nickname in school. I was the school goalkeeper, but yeah, 2 left feet and short sighted, so I wasn't the best goalkeeper in the world. But yeah, in terms of journalism, it was a funny one really, because my interest was in law. I've always been interested in kind of true crime and stuff like that, and I always fancied going into law. I've always been fascinated with the psychology around law and things like that. So I left comprehensive with good GCSEs, went to do my A levels, and they were all catered towards pursuing a career in law. And as it was, yeah, I found the first year of A levels really, really tough, compared to like GCSE, where I'd breezed through them, got really good marks, and only just seeing made it, scraped it through onto me second year of A levels, which at that point you then, picking what you're going to do at university. And I remember being quite worried. I mean, I essentially at college did both years in the second year because I resat all of my first year exams. But of course, before you do that, you're picking your university course, you're making your choices for university. And I remember not being confident that I'd get the grades I needed to go and do law. So I'll never forget, it was like a personality test. And it kind of threw out suggestions, and it was a huge like test, and it just asked you all sorts about yourself. It took quite a while to do, and it spewed out these suggestions at the end of it. And I always remember sports journalism being one at the top, and it never been something I'd ever considered. I mean, I'd delivered papers around the area. I'd always had a thing like I'd go to my grand's on a Sunday, and my uncles would sit around the table filling in a crossword in the paper, and I'd always once to finish pick it up and read papers. Like I'd always enjoyed journalism, but I'd never considered it as a career until this personality test threw it out at us. And yeah, as I say, because I was kind of at a stage in my life where I was thinking, I don't think I'm gonna be, like good enough to go into law really. Sports journalism became a serious option then. As it happens, as I say, I resat all of my first year exams in the second year while doing my second year exams. I actually came out with good marks. I got an A in law, for example, which so I could have gone into law had I have wanted to. I would have had the grades in the end, but it's one of them moments where you think, like it happens for a reason, because I ended up going into sports journalism, which I never have thought of. And it's, as I'm sure most will appreciate, it's an absolute dream job for a football fan.
Absolutely, and I know that in your early career you worked for the Chronicle, and you did some work with you covered Sunderland with them, and then it was a couple of years back that you got the job covering Middlesbrough, wasn't it? So how did that come about, and what was it kind of like making that transition in terms of covering Middlesbrough and being their dedicated reporter?
Yeah, so it was, as you say, I started working for the Chronicle. I think it was 8, 9 years ago now, and it was part of a digital drive from the company that is Reach PLC now. And they obviously own the Gazette and also the Chronicle, and it was part of a digital drive to kind of build the Sunderland audience there. And that was when I was brought in, and you kind of move up that ladder within there and develop as a journalist over the years there. And I remember it was about 6 months into COVID, I think it was. There was a lot of restructuring went on in the company, and the way Sunderland was going to be covered was starting to change. And of course, at that time, Phil and Vic, long-serving, brilliant Middlesbrough writers at the Gazette, decided it was their time and they were moving on, and that kind of role at the Gazette just unexpectedly became available. And for me, it was the perfect next step. As I say, all my family are from that way, so I've always had close ties with Middlesbrough. My grandma, she still buys the Gazette every day now, and she did. That's not just because I write for them. She's done that for years. Long before I joined. So there's always been that connection now with the Gazette as well, and it just felt like a perfect next move for me in terms of taking that next step to become, if you like, the main writer for a football club. When I was still covering Sunderland, I was kind of second man behind James Hunter, who's the Chronicle Sunderland man. He's another long-serving writer. I think he's just shy of 25 years covering that football club. He's a fantastic writer, someone in my early career who was, fantastic just to be around in an office and kind of sit and learn from and listen to and things like that. He's always been brilliant to me as James. But yeah, so the Middlesbrough role coming up really was just that opportunity to kind of get out there and become that main writer myself.
Absolutely, and you mentioned it before about how it's a sort of dream job, I guess, for any football fan. But most of all, covering Middlesbrough, for any Middlesbrough supporter, it's just the absolute dream gig to be paid to follow the team around the country, home and away, speak to the managers, speak to the players. Just an absolute dream. So, from your point of view, Craig, just talk us through, like for people that might not know, like talk us through what your working week sort of like looks like. So, how much exposure do you get to the club, and how does your diary fill up in link? I guess in link with Middlesbrough and their schedule.
Yeah, so it's an interesting one. I think one of the brilliant things about a job in journalism, a career in journalism, is that it can be so unexpected. You can plan to an extent for your week. For example, we always know a Michael Carrick press conference for a Saturday game will be at roughly 2 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon. It'll change here and there, but that's generally the time you're looking at for a Michael Carrick press conference for a Saturday game. If you've got a midweek game, it'll probably be 2 p.m. on the Monday. So you'll plan for those things. Obviously, from there, the week can be anything. Your news is news. Ultimately, it happens when it happens, and you've always just got to be prepared for whatever comes. Obviously, you plan your week around the fixtures. So, if there's a long away game during the week or at the weekend, obviously you've got to factor in your traveling time and whatnot. But yeah, it's such an interesting career because there is that element of unexpected to it. I mean, we always try and have stories, have features, have interviews, or have Michael Carrick quotes saved up. Just you never know when there might be a rainy day. But there is a lot of kind of alternative thinking needed, if that's the right way of putting it, in terms of you've always got to be prepared for a quiet day and have ideas in your mind of ways you can tell stories, ways you can present things in different ways, and always you mentioned that's a dream job for Middlesbrough supporters, and that's never lost on me. I think the importance of the job I do, I'm ultimately serving Middlesbrough supporters in the job that I do, so you want to make your content as interesting for them as it possibly can be. You want to discuss the things that they want to hear you discussing. You want to discuss the things or find out the things that they want to know. And yeah, you have within that you have relationships. You build relationships within the club. Obviously, there's a press office there, and you ring them regularly to find out stuff. But it's always useful to have other contacts within the club, and it's always fascinated me since I've joined the Gazette that there seems to be this conception. And I think it probably stems from a few years back. This is before I joined the Gazette, that I think Steve Gibson had banned the club for a year or two, hadn't he? And relationships soured for a little while. But, long before I joined, those relations had repaired. And, you only have to look at Vic, for example, who, he now works for the football club, having left the Gazette. So, I mean, that tells you everything you need to know about, what Steve Gibson thought about Vic. On a personal level and also that relationship. I mean, I've got to say, it's no secret he's not as hands-on these days, Steve Gibson. He coming out of COVID, he obviously had all these other businesses that needed a bit of due care and attention because of the pandemic and the impact of that. And obviously he brought in Kieran Scott to manage the football side of things. Neil Bowser's there as his chief executive, running things day to day. So he's perhaps not as hands-on as he once was, but since I joined the Gazette, I remember early on dropping him a message. I never like to kind of ring people like that off the cuff and kind of surprise them, so I just dropped him a message, introduced myself, explained who I was, and within an hour he'd rang straight away, and introduced himself. We had an introductory chat and things like that, and ever since then intermittently, like he'll get in touch and he'll help us out as much as he possibly can. I can honestly, hand on heart, say Steve Gibson has been so helpful since I've been in this role. And there's often I see a misconception that like people think Steve Gibson still hates the Gazette, but it certainly doesn't seem to be that way from my interactions with him.
Absolutely, yeah. As you said, he's kind of turned into almost like a slightly kind of mysterious figure, I guess, because he's not, I don't know, like some owners, I guess, in the Premier League and the Championship. He doesn't like the limelight. He's not out in the media or releasing long 5,000 word statements every week, like one particular chairman in the Championship, for example. He does like to keep himself to himself. And I guess from your point of view, Craig, in terms of your relationships with the club outside of that, obviously you're seeing Michael Carrick once, twice, 3 times a week at the moment. Obviously, you're speaking to the players after the games and that sort of thing. So what kind of relationship do you have with the manager and the players on a weekly basis?
So it's all very kind of managed now. I mean, you go back, I spoke about James Hunter, who I kind of shadowed early on in my career, who, as I say, is approaching 25 years covering Sunderland now. And you go back to, perhaps when he first started, and, in some cases, press offices didn't really exist at football clubs. It was, the manager would send emails and, you'd go in and you'd just, there was, let me just quickly Google it. I should know this. It's Dennis Smith. Sorry, I didn't need to Google it. He was Dennis Smith, a former Sunderland manager, was at a Middlesbrough game just recently, and we were sat talking to him, and there was one of the older hacks. I hope he doesn't mind me calling him that. Ian Murta was sat with us, and Murta was kind of a young journalist at the time when Dennis was managing at Sunderland, and they were reminiscing together, and they were talking about back then. I think you would be talking early 90s from memory. Dennis would have a daily press conference, but it wouldn't be a press conference as such. He would just invite all the media guys into his office, and they'd just sit for an hour or two, just chatting in his office. And then, every journalist would go away with a line each day. But it's in terms of players, I mean, at the Chronicle, Gibbo, John Gibson's kind of a legendary old chief sports writer at the Chronicle, and Middlesbrough fans will probably be aware of Malcolm MacDonald, Super Mac from the Three Legends and whatnot. And Gibbo and Super Mac were best friends when Super Mac was Newcastle's number 9. And the stories of, like, after games, Gibbo would file his copy for the Monday paper, and it would be Supermac quotes, but he'd never actually interviewed Supermac. Supermac was in the shower. Gibbo would tap up these quotes, quoting them to Supermac, and then the pair of them would hit the town every Saturday night after a Newcastle game. They were best friends, and they're still really good friends now to this day. But those kind of things ended, a good few years ago now. Press offices became more prominent, and they're a lot more guarded now. It's rare your social media to some extent, but I think even on there, players are well trained on social media, and they're guarded, and building those kind of relations with players isn't easy. It's very much on the club's terms. So after a game, we'll always get a player, and you'll get to interview a player, and you get to know them. When once you start interviewing them a few times, they get to know your face. They grow, if you like, a level of trust in you. They know who you are, but there's not much of ever a relationship there like there would have been once upon a time. The manager, it depends on the manager. I mean, I had no secret, I had a really good relationship with Neil Warnock. I could phone Neil at any time, and he would pick up the phone, and he was obviously a brilliant source of information. Chris could be. You could ring Chris now and then, and Chris Wilder would respond and things like that. But he preferred to keep it, in house in terms of we'll talk during the press conferences. Michael Carrick's different again. He's been pleasant. I wouldn't see anything other than that. But there's never been any signs really of a desire there to have any more than a professional relationship. There's no handing his phone number out and saying ring us whenever you want or anything like that. It's very much a case of, half an hour during the press conference, ask us what you want and I will say that about him is he's not, he's not bothered about what you ask him. You can ask him absolutely anything. He'll not twist about it or anything like that. He's happy to sit there and answer anything. But yeah, there's certainly no signs there that he wants any kind of relationship beyond that with any journalist, really. And I think, you could tell just watching his press conferences that if he didn't have to, he probably wouldn't do press conferences. But unfortunately, they're part of his job.
Mm. Absolutely. Now, I was going to ask about managers, I guess in general. I was going to kind of go into them like one by one, but you've sort of like done that already. But I think obviously managers have like different personalities. Like you mentioned, Neil Warnock was maybe a lot more open with the media and with you in particular, compared to Chris Wilder and Michael Carrick. So what kind of difference does that make to the way that you cover the club? Is there sort of a, I don't know. Do you find that do you find that you almost get like better stories when you're dealing with a manager who's a little bit more open, or do you find it is a little bit harder to warm to a manager who is a little bit more of a closed book? Because obviously I've worked on the regional beat before, and I don't mind talking about it. When I was covering QPR, I worked with Ian Holloway, who was a pretty tricky one to kind of work with. And one week it'd be
Oh,
absolutely
really?
brilliant.
Yeah.
He'd absolutely love it, and then the next week he'd be quite tricky, let's say, or a little bit prickly, let's say, in his press conferences. And it was a little bit hot and cold, and it kind of made it a little bit tricky to sort of work with him. So, from your point of view, what kind of impact does it have when a manager has a different personality to his predecessor?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. It sounds similar to Chris Wilder in that, Chris one week could be great, and then other weeks he could be prickly, particularly after defeats. He was hard to interview after defeats. But no, I don't think it impacts me much, really. I mean, obviously it's so much easier when you work with someone like Neil Warnock. You'd ask Neil one question, half an hour later, he'd still be going, giving you all sorts of anecdotes, loads of colour. It was so easy to interview Neil Warnock and come away with, a ton of stories. He was brilliant, and I always say I think Neil Warnock was the perfect manager for Middlesbrough at that time. Obviously, it was COVID. Fans were, stuck out of the stadium. That was my first season covering Boro, and obviously, season I'll always remember for that reason, but also because it was just so weird with no fans in stadiums. And again, we talked about that, not being lost on me, like how privileged I am to be in this role. And I think that season in particular, it really hit home because obviously we still were allowed to travel home and away and be at the grounds when fans ultimately weren't. So, it wasn't lost on me. But I think Neil Warnock was perfect at that time. His general manners and his mannerisms and his humour and his storytelling, it just helped everyone still feel connected at a time when it would have been so easy to become disconnected from it. So it was easier in that sense. But in terms of someone now like a Michael Carrick, who he isn't as easy to get stuff out of, he isn't as forthcoming, he isn't as colourful, he doesn't give as many anecdotes. I don't think that particularly changes much of what I do. It just ultimately means I have to work that little bit harder. And ultimately the onus is on me. I'm the journalist. I'm the one that is ultimately there to extract that information. So I've got to make sure I'm asking, or as best I can, asking the right questions to get the right information. He's not by any means, I don't think, trying to conceal anything deliberately or anything like that. And naturally, at any football club, there'll be, certain things that they'll want to keep internalized and not put out there. Injuries are a good example. For he's very keen not to give too much away on injuries. That's clear, but it's part of the job where you've got to go and you've got to try and ask the questions to get that information, because it's ultimately what people want to know. And yeah, I think the only way it really changes my job, it doesn't change anything in terms of what I think of anybody or anything like that. It ultimately puts the onus on me to work that little bit harder to get that information, which ultimately I still consider myself kind of new in this role, if you like. This is only my third year covering the club, my third year being that kind of main writer. So ultimately it's good for my kind of development and my learning as well, because each week I am learning, I am developing in terms of ways that you've got to push to get that information.
Absolutely, and just a final bit on this little section, I guess. So obviously, you mentioned before, you're Man United fan, grew up in Sunderland, surrounded by Sunderland fans, I guess, in terms of like where you lived and that sort of thing. But now that you're covering Middlesbrough and you're into your third year covering the club, would you say that Middlesbrough have got under your skin slightly? Is it hard not to fall in love with a club? I guess when you're covering them week in, week out, and day to day.
Oh, 100%. Like I would say, I think it's made so much easier at a club like Middlesbrough because it's such a good club. You know, everywhere you look, like we spoke about Steve Gibson earlier. I know we see he's not as hands on, but you know, he'd argue he still is. He speaks to Michael Carrick, you know, after every match and probably more. You know, he's not completely ignoring Middlesbrough by any stretch. He's still, you know, very much the man at the top making the big decisions and whatnot, and still, you know, there just about every game. And you know, you see with things like he does, like, you know, little things like obviously he had to raise the season ticket prices for this season. He called all the fan groups in for a meeting about that and explained why he was doing it, etc. And you know, just little things like that. I know it's not great that he had to raise the season ticket prices. Obviously, the fans are ultimately hit in a cost of living crisis. But you know, his main desire is to keep Middlesbrough as competitive as they possibly can be in the Championship. And you know, he didn't have to, and many wouldn't have bothered doing that with the fans in terms of getting them in and explaining that. And I think, you know, right from the very top with Steve, who is obviously a Middlesbrough supporter himself, rare in itself now in the English game, particularly at this level, to have an owner who loves the club as much as the fans because he is one himself. Right throughout the club, there's so many great people working at that football club. You know, for a club of its size, it is a big club. It maintains the community feel of a smaller club, if that makes sense. You know, you go further down the pyramid, you find a lot more community in clubs. And yeah, I remember the years I was covering Sunderland, that was, you know, into the years of Ellis Short, mainly the US businessman. And you know, he was an absent owner, really. You never heard from him, you never saw him. You know, he plowed a lot of money in, but he trusted the wrong people with that money ultimately. And you know, there was a struggle to have that connection. Whereas at Middlesbrough, it's such a good community club. You know, there's a brilliant fan base there. You see that last week in the, you know, the numbers that travel to Exeter and Plymouth. You know, absolutely fantastic. As you see, you follow a club up and down the country, and it's impossible not to fall in love with it. Like, I genuinely, hand on heart, now see it on a weekend. As I say, I was a boyhood Man United fan, and you know, probably helped by the fact that in recent years there's a lot gone on at that football club that's just, you know, really soured my love for it. The European Super League was kind of the final straw for me, really. There'd been a couple of things, and then obviously there was the Mason Greenwood you know, saga recently, and the statements that they put out after that. And you know, it just sours my love for that club ever so slightly a bit. It just chips away at it bit by bit. And then, as I say, you follow in Middlesbrough home and away, it's impossible not to fall in love. It really is. Like, I genuinely now on a weekend, offer me a Man United win or a Middlesbrough win, I'd prompt for the Middlesbrough win every time. I get so much more joy at the minute of seeing Middlesbrough win and seeing Middlesbrough do well. You see how much it means to all the supporters as well. You know, that night down at Old Trafford, that was my first ever time covering a game at Old Trafford. It was big. I know you were there, Phil. It was a big night for me, like going to Old Trafford and covering a game. It was a bit of a career dream, if you like. But you know, seeing the 9,500 Middlesbrough fans over to me right, and the noise they made all that night. You know, I said before the game, like, with all those travelling fans and whatnot, that meant more to Middlesbrough than it did Man United. And I genuinely wanted Middlesbrough to win that game, and I was absolutely over the moon when they did. So yeah, I mean, it's hard. Like, you know, there's a lot of Middlesbrough fans have put a lot more kind of time and money and effort into supporting the club. It almost feels like, yeah, I'd be a bit of an imposter to call myself a Middlesbrough supporter now. But yeah, I mean, I love the club. I really do love the club.
Absolutely, and I just wanted to ask you a little bit about what's kind of going on at the moment at Reach PLC. I'm not going to put you on the spot because I know that it's a bit of a precarious situation. There are a lot of people impacted, and obviously it is still a moving picture as well. Nothing is sort of set in stone, so I'm not going to make you divulge absolutely everything that's sort of going on from that point of view. But I guess in terms of the Gazette and Teesside Live, Middlesbrough are one of the few clubs in the EFL and the Premier League even still to have dedicated coverage on a regional level. So I grew up reading the Gazette, and I grew up reading Eric Taylor, and you mentioned before about Phil Tallentire and Anthony Vickers and Dom Shaw, who you worked with before he went to the Northern Echo. All of these kind of guys, for me personally, were a huge inspiration in terms of getting into journalism in the first place. From your point of view, Craig, I know you've mentioned before about the Chronicle and working with James Hunter at Sunderland, but to you, why is regional coverage so important to football and to a club like Middlesbrough?
I think ultimately, regional journalists will just cover a club more extensively than anybody else. For example, if the Gazette and the Northern Echo weren't there, obviously we have BBC Tees as well. They're your three kind of main regional outlets covering the football club. If they weren't there, intermittently you have some national journalists come and go, but they're not following the club as closely day in, day out. And, touch wood, in my 3 years now covering Boro, there haven't been many, if any, situations where, there's been a need to be overly critical or there's been anything going drastically wrong. But, you see all throughout the EFL in particular, like, bad people now are getting involved at football clubs. That's no secret, owners buying clubs who are not good people in a lot of clubs, going into financial difficulty and whatnot. And I think regional journalism is so important because it's ultimately the regional journalists above all else who will have, hands on the ground, have their eyes to it more than anybody else in the industry. And they're the ones ultimately that will be fighting for a football when it is in danger. As I say, touch wood, that's never been a problem. And I don't emphasize it ever being a problem while Steve Gibson is in charge of Middlesbrough. But, one day, if Steve Gibson, for whatever reason, decided to sell up, it's outlets like the Gazette, like the Northern Echo, like BBC Tees, who would be there fighting for the club and what's best for the club. Making sure that again, I don't think it ever would, because I think Steve Gibson, even if he was to ever sell, would make sure it was going into the right hands as best he could. But you look at things like what's happened at Wigan, for example, and they've got a fantastic local journalist down there called Paul Kendrick, who does so much for that football club. And I think regional journalism is so important in terms of, it is that so closely connected to the football club. And ultimately, as a regional paper, you have the football club at your heart as well. I've just spoken about how much I love the football club now. That's important as a regional journalist. Ultimately, you've got to want the best for that football club. And because of that, like a fan, you have that protective bubble of that football club. And, we all know, I know there's a tendency now to think of football clubs as a business for many people, and obviously there are many investors who come into the game now from other countries with that business side of it in mind and all the money of it in mind. But ultimately, football clubs are much more than just a business. To its supporters and whatnot, that football club is everything, and your local media will always be there to kind of stick up for the club. At times, hold it to account if it needs to be held to account. And that's something that, particularly when you're not in the Premier League, national media aren't really able to do, because they've obviously got a much wider audience. They're not just writing for a local audience. They're not just writing for Middlesbrough supporters. National media have understandably got to think, would I don't know, your average Manchester City, Manchester United, Bournemouth fan be interested in this story about Middlesbrough? That's always the thinking of national media. Whereas for us, our thinking is purely, does this interest a Middlesbrough fan? our audience is Middlesbrough supporters, and we ultimately serve Middlesbrough supporters, and that for me is why, you know, regional media and closely covering a football club is so important, because we have that, you know, that heart and that protection for that football club in mind.
Brilliant. Well said, Craig. Well said indeed. Yes, I think it's very important for to a lot of Middlesbrough fans that obviously that yourself and Teesside Live carry on covering Middlesbrough, because, as I said, it is a huge pillar in the Middlesbrough community, and a vital part of how we consume news about Middlesbrough Football Club. So yeah, great to see that the coverage will be continuing. The show goes on, so to speak, for now at least. Yeah. And yeah, that's great news. But yeah, thank you very much for speaking to me, Craig. We're going to press pause on this now. We're going to have you back for part 2, where we're going to pick your brains on all things Middlesbrough and what's going on at the moment. And thankfully, it is quite an upbeat conversation after the last few weeks. So yeah, we'll catch up with you soon.